All right, I see a lot of little icons flashing, so I think we're good. So welcome everyone. This is the 2022 edition of the Toronto React Meetup. That's exciting, right? I know things are coming back to normal, but one thing we found out is that online meetups are actually pretty exciting, right? So we hope you all had a nice time joining here on Zoom. Let's hope you're not super fatigued of already having done Zoom the entire day at your work. But we have some very exciting things to talk about today, right? All things React and a lot of adjacent technologies. I have here with me Adam Sullovey, solution architect at Rangle. Adam is one of our more creative and excited solution architects, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about life after Redux. That's a very interesting topic that I'm pretty sure we're going to really appreciate. I'm Jason Santos. I'm a senior leader here at Rangle, also a software developer. And I'm here because Rangle is amazing at sponsoring these types of events, right? I'm pretty sure you folks, if you're here, you heard about Rangle, right? We're a consultancy, and our main thing is to partner with our clients to kind of solve their most complex technical problems, right? We work very smart, and boy, we work fast, right? We can deliver like best-in-class apps in 3 months, and we've been able to deliver design systems in record time. Not only because we type really fast, but because like we have a lot of knowledge in that, not only on that subject, but on all things digital. Like our ways of working enable us to accelerate the digital adoption and the digital mindset on organizations of all sizes, right? Rangle was created on a meetup almost 9 years ago, so we make a point of always being true to that central proposal, right? Like to be dedicated to learning and to sharing knowledge. So without further ado, I'm gonna give you folks Adam that's gonna talk to us about life after Redux. Adam, that's with you.
Showtime. Alrighty. I'll get the screen share going. This window. Can I see some green borders? Are we looking at a life after Redux slide? Thumbs up. Yeah, perfect. Okay, here we go. So this talk is life after Redux. Hello, I'm Adam. I'm a solution architect here at Rangle. And yeah, I guess another way of saying life after Redux is like state management with React context and custom hooks. So why this talk? I want to share what I've learned living Redux free since late 2019. Sounds like I used to be addicted or something. And I want to be able to help you make some more informed decisions about state management in your own applications. And hold on, I'm missing the window that has my own notes in it. Where'd that go? One moment, please. Window. There it is. All right, resuming. And also a few years ago, there were a lot of blog posts coming out trying to prove that Redux is dead. You don't need it anymore, but they'd only provide these little tiny code samples. And I always found that kind of frustrating. I want to go deeper and figure out what it's like in the real world. So here's the plan for the next 30, 40, some number of minutes like that. We're going to quickly zoom through my past and how it influences my thoughts on state management. We are going to make a little React context, like tutorial-sized application. And then we're going to see how React context fit into a very ambitious project I worked on a few years ago. And knowing what I know now, how could that have been done better? And also sort of in general, what have I learned from this? So here we go into the part about me. When I grew up making web applications, the view layer tended to dominate, and state was just a thing that you had to sort of fit in there somehow. So if I think back to building things with jQuery, the DOM is your state. There's no real separate piece of data. There's no copy of the things in your form fields. There's just your form fields. When I moved to using Backbone.js, though the components it provided gave you a place to store state inside of them, but it was still up to developers to decide how do my components react to those state changes. And you had to write some really imperative code and be super specific about what would happen. And then I moved over to Angular.js. And in this case, your state is sort of spread out amongst a bunch of different services and views, and the framework is trying to help you keep those things synced up. But half the time, things aren't really working the way you hoped, and it can get really slow and hard to debug and run on sentence for comedic effect. It just wasn't always the greatest. And then I came to this. So finally got to try out Redux in 2016 or so, and I liked it. So the key thing is that state, rather than being a thing that sort of just gets wedged into the side of the application somewhere, really becomes the heart of your application. And all the HTML and CSS is just there to show how it's changing. And when I say it's the heart of your application, I mean, like, with a Redux-based application, you can turn off your UI. And if you have a way to dispatch actions at the store and read the reducers to see the results of those actions, you can pretty much run your application just like without a UI. You just have to be able to talk to the store. And the other nice thing about it was that nobody can manipulate state directly. Everyone has to dispatch actions the same way. So if you've ever seen architectural diagrams where there seems to be like this neat order amongst all the different components that make up your application, and then there's like this one squiggly line arrow thing that's pointing from one part to another and totally doesn't fit into everything else, that's like someone cheating and manipulating states in the wrong way. And Redux made that really hard to do. So those two things combined made this feel like a big upgrade to me. So 2016 to 2019, I was pretty happy working with Redux, especially the dev tools. I really liked the time travel debugging. I really liked being able to dump the whole store into a JSON file and then restore it later. That was good for trying to debug tricky to reach application states. I was fully on board with dividing your components into like presentational and connected components or smart and dumb components. Made so much sense to me. And the reselect library made it really easy to deal with derived state and have some testable code. So I was pretty happy. I admit there were downsides. A lot of overhead, a lot of time spent making a lot of files, different things for reducers, actions, side effects, the types for all of those. It was predictable, but it was a lot. And sometimes onboarding people from very object-oriented programming backgrounds was tricky. You had to sort of make them think in a whole new way. And sometimes that took time and a lot of pull request reviews. In 2019, I joined a new team working with Rangle. I switched to another client. And they had a very ambitious project that did not use Redux for global state management. It used this newly supported React context thing, which I hadn't really looked into at the time. And my first thought was, oh no. I was kind of suspicious of this. And thank you to Webcomic Name for making an image that just shows how I felt so well. So I'll come back to this very ambitious project later, but let's talk about context and hooks for a little bit. So we're going to zoom through making a little tutorial sized application. So if you're wondering what this React context thing is, the docs say, literally, context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. context is designed to share data that can't be considered global for a tree of React components, such as the current authenticated user, theme, or preferred language. These are great use cases for it. So I tend to think of it as magic because I remember doing a lot of prop drilling with React back in the day. The idea that something at the bottom of the tree of components could communicate with something up at the top without having to go through every layer in the middle. Magic. So to me, it's like wormholes being punched through your application so you can fly around really quick. So if you wanted to use this, here's a quick demo. The first thing you would do is use create context, which is part of React, and you might throw it into a shopping cart context constant. And this lives outside of any components or hooks. It's just sitting in one of your modules. And then we're going to work our way up and outward through this code sample. So that context we just created can render a provider, or it provides a component called a provider, and you get to pass it a value prop, which contains all of the stuff that you want to share with other parts of your application. We've got items and add to cart in this case. In order to create those things, add to cart, and update the values with them, you get to use the usual React state management tools. So use states, use effect, use callback, setters, the same stuff you'd use in your regular components. And all this stuff is going to get wrapped inside of another component, which we're going to call the shopping cart provider. Because I was looking for ways to relate this back to other things I was familiar with, I can relate it back to Redux. So think of using like use states or use the use reducer hooks to do things like store data, to provide ways to access the data, or to provide callbacks for changing your data. So it takes the place of various other various other Redux-y jargon things. And then use effect takes on a few roles as well. So this would trigger your state changes when the app starts and synchronize with other things happening outside of React. And those used to be, I used to think those were the roles of sagas, observables, and thunks, which were different middleware add-ons for Redux. So going back to this tutorial-sized application, that provider we just made now gets to wrap the whole application you're working on. So here's the visual part of the UI, and here's our global state stuff up at the top of the hierarchy. And one more step here, we're going to make a custom hook, which just calls React's use context, and that's gonna point at the shopping cart context we created at the first step. And this is going to get used for consuming data that's in that global context provider. So now when we make our components, like our navigation bar or our product description page, which are like in the middle of that little code sample we looked at, we can call our custom hook and pull out pieces of data or pull out functions from it in order to set different values to access or set different values that are stored globally. And you'll notice there's no props here. These values are just coming out of the custom hook and the context we made. So if you want to test out your provider, you can usually isolate it. So say our shopping cart provider made use of some API module, we would fake those, replace its methods with say some like jest functions. And then we can write a test that uses render hook to render the state of to render the hook, and then we can check in on the state of the cart and go like, have functions in it been called or what values are in there. Different testing strategies might say like do check those values. Other testing strategies might say like don't touch the internals. Those are both options, but that's what testing might look like. We'll skip this one because time. And if you want to test a component that uses that provider, which we just tested, you can mock the provider. So here I'm using Jest again to make a mock of that custom use shopping cart state hook. And then I can render my navigation bar component and confirm that it puts certain text on the screen. In this case, the cart's got 0 things in the array, so I expect it to render the number 0. Or I can change what the mock provides to say this has 3 items, so I expect my navigation bar component to put the number 3 on the screen. Another thing I have to touch on is Storybook. So if you're going to put your navigation bar or your cart into Storybook, it depends on this being available. But rather than including our original provider with all its state management stuff, we can just make a simpler provider and pass it some hard-coded values. And then our navigation bar will be able to render within Storybook. And I think with that, it's safe to say we've proved Redux is dead. Good work, everyone. Have a good night. I'm out. This is my complaint. A lot of these tutorials never really showed the full picture. And I had an amazing opportunity to see just how little of the picture they showed with this very ambitious project that I mentioned briefly earlier. So let's look at how these techniques fit into that really ambitious project. So how ambitious is it? And what's my relationship to it, I guess. So this was a new product that was development started on it in 2018, and Rangle helped out between 2019 and 2021. And it's a food ordering application. You use it to pick things off a menu, pay for them, track delivery, participate in loyalty programs, all that stuff. It's made for multiple brands of restaurants. So it's one platform with many different configurations. And with that, it can be built into many different user interfaces for different restaurants. And I say many different user interfaces because this is a cross-platform thing. So it's used for responsive websites. There are iOS and Android apps that use the same code base. Oop, I zoomed in somehow. There we go. There are Ionic-based mobile apps for iOS and Android that use this code base, and also some kiosks in restaurants with really big touchscreens that run off of this as well. And this whole thing is also internationalized. So it's taking orders and payments and delivering food in multiple languages on multiple continents. And something that I thought was really amazing was adding a new country to this. Only takes a few weeks or a couple of months. It's not a months or years long kind of thing. So to me, this is a pretty impressive large scope. And it was also the largest team I've ever worked with in terms of number of people all contributing to the same code base. So in late 2020, there were over 40 developers in North America and Europe working on this. And when you add in all the other stakeholders fulfilling different roles, we were close to 80 people. And it kept growing. In 2021, it was even bigger. And this multi-brand, cross-platform, internationalized project with a big team chose to manage state with Apollo for interacting with their backend and headless CMS through GraphQL. They used React Router because a little bit of state lives up in the address bar. And they chose to use React Context for all the other user interface stuff. And that includes things like derived data, like when things come from the back end, but it's not quite the right shape and we have to manipulate it a little bit and store it. It was used for in-browser state, like talking to the geolocation API in our browser or keeping track of other choices the user has made. And also for interacting with other third-party services like logging and analytics. And you may ask, like, why? Why would someone choose React Context, this relatively newish thing, over Redux? So let's pretend it's 2018. It's the year before I joined this product team, and this project is just getting off the ground. It's a company that doesn't have a reputation for technology, so hiring is really hard. Hiring developers was competitive in 2018 as well. So the tech team made this decision that they were going to run their business and product people through a coding boot camp, and then strive to keep the code base pretty simple so that these junior developers could make meaningful contributions to it. And you got to admit, like, leaving Redux out of the picture makes things a lot simpler for those new developers. This team also had to show results to their stakeholders very quickly to sort of maintain investment and ensure their projects continue. And as you're going to see, if you haven't seen already, React context is very flexible. There's a lot less overhead compared to Redux. GraphQL and Apollo had already been chosen for interacting with the backend and CMS. So why add another big library on top of that? And how much other state could there possibly be? And around the time the project was starting, there were much bigger decisions to make. And I think those were taking away from the debate over front-end state management tools. People had to decide, like, what database are we going to store millions of food orders in? Where are we going to host this? And what's the best thing to even build first? So going with the option that required the least thought might probably save some effort at the start. So pretend we're still in like 2018 to 2021. So how's it working out? So I think in years 1 to 2, this choice worked out really, really well, and it enabled the initial team to move pretty quickly. But years 2 and 3 in, so like 2019, 2020, there were some challenges that came up as we scaled up the team and scaled up the product. And my personal scientific evidence of this is that there were a lot more angry Skeletor emojis popping up in Slack than like other happy things. So before I go and talk about the unhappy things, there were a lot of good things to talk about in this project as well. So our big group of people was divided up into many teams. We were all contributing code to the same repo and running into surprisingly few Git conflicts for how much was happening. So the way we had things divided up must have made sense. It made sense in some ways. And we were selling more food online than ever before, taking share away from like the physical restaurants, exceeding goals we had set. We were deploying new features every week, and our App Store and Google Play ratings on all our applications were trending up. So yeah, a lot of the companies I work with never get this far. So before I point out the bad things, I must say, like, lots of good things were happening. But still, one day one of the team leads asked, so what bugs are we deploying? And they went through a history of recent issues, and they figured out about a quarter of them were issues caused by front-end state management. These were things like buttons being disabled when they should have been enabled. They were unnecessary redirects from one page to another that might have been happening due to race conditions. And there were extra HTTP requests and React renders being made, which slowed down the application. And these lead to business problems, right? So customers get frustrated and abandon their orders, and we lose sales. Or we find our customers make more requests to support about missing orders or problems signing in. And therefore, we have to hire more support staff to get through the queue of tickets and issue more refunds, which not only loses us money for the orders, but also like fees from the payment merchants. And we also have to send more data to our logging and analytics systems so that we can troubleshoot the bugs that are popping up in productions. And that means all of our vendors make more money off of us. So one day, the whole team, all of us in Slack, a question was posed. How do we fix our front-end state management issues? And as you can imagine, a lot of passionate discussions followed. I'm just looking at the time, 6:26. All right. So there were responses were sort of divided into two camps. We could migrate state management from context to a more established library. These were some of the other players that were in the space at the time. The other option was keep using context, but use it better. We've got some fundamental issues with our architecture. And if we don't fix these and change our practices, we can write buggy code with any of the 4 libraries above. These are not the silver bullet for us. So for the sake of this talk, let's explore the second option, because it's life after Redux, right? And the other, something I want to point out right now is that it is so much easier for me to talk about this stuff a year later, like being detached from the project and with a lot more online resources available. I'm going to point out a lot of problems. And while I was on the project, I was part of the problem sometimes as well. So when I'm saying developers were doing strange things, I was probably doing strange things. But I've learned and I can share what I've learned. Something to keep in mind as we talk about this is evolution over the course of a few years. So I talked about the project in 2018, and it was a few people who had been through boot camps and the leads. But over the course of 3 years, this grew to nearly 100 people. And when the team was small, it was very cohesive. A lot of the developers had the same bootcamp training, and they wrote very similar code to each other. But as the team grew, like yes, the average skill level went up, but I think cohesion amongst the team members went down as people with different skill sets joined, and communication overhead increased. So there was sort of less consistency, or it was harder to share information across the group. And of course, over 3 years, the scope of the project grew. So more countries came online, more functionality was added, and more stakeholders got involved. And there were more integrations with other third-party services. So we'll get into it. So this application had 30 global contexts. If you think back to that shopping cart example, it had one, just the shopping cart context. But this one had 30, and some of these names have been changed. The list is intentionally supposed to be overwhelming, though. When you look at these in the React dev tools, you'd sort of see this giant stack of all of our context providers. And even if these had clear names, it's still a lot of things to look through, a lot of indenting. And some of these contexts were humongous. So if we were to look at the order provider, it was exposing this much stuff globally. There's a lot of functions and a lot of information that could be imported, well, not quite imported, but could be called or viewed from inside of any component. And in order to generate all of that state and update other parts of the application, this one provider had to import about 16 other providers just to keep everything synced up. And it was a pretty long piece of code too. It was like over 1,000 lines in order to manage that giant list of variables we just looked at. So my first question is sort of like, how did this get so big? And I think the first thing I want to raise is like, I like TypeScript, but it does this interesting thing where the autocomplete is so good that it's like it removes human memory as a constraint on design. So, and that makes it really easy to grow huge interfaces of unrelated things. If you think back to when you don't have autocomplete and you have to keep track of where all these properties are, you tend to group things. You think harder about grouping things. And I think that goes away sometimes when you're using TypeScript. You don't have to think about, will this be easy to recall later? I think another thing is that context providers are really easy to change. They make the thing that was hard with Redux really easy to do. We used to complain about boilerplate in Redux. Now there's like no boilerplate. So adding a new global property or a function into that giant list is often the path of least resistance to solve a problem. And there's inertia as well. So adding new state globally sort of becomes the default thing to do, because that's where all the other related stuff is. If you had something related to orders, your first thought might be, let's put it in that order context, because it's got orders in the name and lots of order related things in there. And you might end up doing that for data that isn't widely shared. And then if you try to talk about refactoring it, it's a pretty big job. So we looked at it, it was like rated as a 13-point story, which might have been a couple of weeks of work. And that type of thing just gets pushed off into the future over and over. So what can you do about it? If you can't refactor, you can definitely set guidelines to change behavior in the future. So I'd ask things like, does the newest member of my team know when something should be in global state? Or are they going to sort of copy everyone else and continue the pattern that we see? I would also be curious, like, does the most junior developer on my team feel confident questioning anybody who decides to add more to the global state if it comes up during code reviews? Do they have the guidelines to back them up about how this should be done? If you can refactor, then go refactor. That'd be awesome. Rethink how different parts of state are grouped together, and rethink what really needs to be exposed globally. Maybe it's okay to have some duplication in different parts of your application if it only needs to be in 2 places. It's something you get to investigate and think about. And another practice I'd encourage is triggering deeper code reviews when global state management grows. So due to the growth of the team and turnover, it's really easy for someone to submit a 20-line pull request, which adds more code to that global state. And it's really easy for someone who doesn't have the whole picture of how the application should work or be structured to approve that pull request. So I consider global state management kind of a sensitive area, and say, like, loop in more people just for those pull requests. Get more opinions and see if you can find other ways to solve that problem together. Another thing that came up was testing was kind of hard. So when we wanted to test that order provider, we had to mock a lot of those other 30 providers sorry, not 30, but a lot of those other, no, it was 30. We had to mock a lot of those other providers just so that the one we were testing could run. And this would also happen in Storybook as well. So, and this made testing kind of hard. Why did this one happen? I think initially there was a preference for integration tests over unit tests. I think the thought was test the application more kind of like in the way it's actually used. And this continued as the team and the product grew. Over time, we developed an end-to-end testing suite, which worked pretty well. And integration tests became harder and harder to manage, just because the application grew. And it took a while for unit tests to take off in this code base. That's something I would have liked to have seen considered sooner. And I think but unit tests would have been really hard to do at first, because a lot of the application's logic was sitting in inline functions inside of useEffect and inside of event handlers like this. And there's no way to isolate this from the rest of React when you want to test it. You have to render the component or render the hook to make this code run. So then you're back to all your dependencies. So looking back at it, here's what I would have done to make testing easier. I would have established some patterns and provided guidelines that makes testing easier for the whole team to use. So one way you can do that is by writing more pure functions. So functions that just take an input and spit out an output and ignore the rest of the world, and use those inside of your useEffects and use them inside of your event handlers. So things like this are really easy to unit test, and you can sort of, I don't quite want to say hope, But ideally, rather than having a lot of integration tests, you try to make sure that this stuff as a whole gets covered in your end-to-end tests. Another thing we found is that adapting to new requirements is hard sometimes. One of the things with context is that the order of these actually matters. The way these are nested, this structure is important. If I think back to Redux, it was like a flat store. But with this, the structure or the order matters. So theoretical scenario, what happens if you want your logging to include information about the network status in all of the log messages? That doesn't work right now, right? Because logger provider is outside or above the network provider. It doesn't have access to that information. So I'm still thinking this one through, but this seems like a form of coupling to me. I'm just not sure which of the 9-ish types it is yet. But something that did help me out was trying to relate this to like a NoSQL or a document database. If I look back at this, I can sort of see it's kind of like having a whole bunch of pre-joined data sitting in a document or a series of documents compared to SQL, where it's a bunch of rows. And the fact that it's pre-joined here, it means that accessing the data in the planned ways, using the access patterns you planned on, is really easy. But when you have to add a new access pattern, things get harder. So in database land, some of the solutions might be like running a migration or adding new indexes or adding more rows that sort of act like indexes so that you can find the data you're looking for faster. And this helped me think of ways of adapting to this problem with contexts that are ordered a certain way. So you can definitely try to reorder the contexts, but that might cause problems elsewhere in the application because other things have the same coupling as well. You can look into refactoring and merging contexts. If data that wasn't related before is now related, maybe that's a good reason to merge things. You can also allow those providers that are in the middle, inside, to start passing information upwards to their outer providers. I think the downside of this is that you're increasing the amount of coupling because now you're expecting two of these. You have two providers that expect to be in a certain order, not just one. But that might be an okay solution. Or maybe you compose those two states into a new one. So we looked at a logger provider and a network status provider. What if you make a network status logging provider, which and a use network status logging hook, which pulls information from both of those contexts and exposes one new logging function. And then you deprecate the old one so that people stop using it over time. That's another way of going about it. I think all of these are valid, but I think it's good to try and pick favorites or prioritize which way would you like to see problems solved and share those with the team so that you get some more consistency across the code base and everyone knows how to handle this scenario. Another thing that comes up is like, why are those context providers like 1,000 lines long? What's going on inside of them? And sometimes it was a lot of this. It was really big use effect callbacks, like hundreds of lines of code manipulating lots of state. And our dependency array would be like 10 things long. And sometimes you'd have a few of these in one file. And they would, if you changed code in a bad way, they'd start triggering each other and you'd end up in these infinite loops or just processes that would like iterate 5 or 6 times before all the values settled. And I found debugging this really complicated, or not complicated, just hard. It was hard work. And this was something that made me really miss the Redux dev tools. So you may ask, why do use effects grow so huge? And why is debugging hard? I think some of it is overusage. We were putting code into use effects that belong inside of event handlers or just belong right inside of the render function. And they could just run on every render, and that would have been okay. There are new React docs being updated right now, which say a lot of similar things. So I do recommend checking out beta.reactjs.org or whatever it is. There's good stuff there. Another issue, I think, is that inline callback doesn't have a name, right? This doesn't have a name. It's just an anonymous function. So without a descriptive name, who's to say what the purpose of that effect is and what belongs or doesn't belong in it? I think it became a free-for-all at some point. Like, you had a problem to solve. Here's some related code. I'm going to put my solution into that existing use effect rather than divide things up in a different way. And in terms of making debugging hard, there's also no name in the stack traces for this. So it was tougher to go find the source of your issues. Another thing I found when I tried to relate this back to Redux is that effects aren't triggered by actions, and they don't trigger actions. So there's no like purchase requested that kicks off a use effect from running, and a use effect doesn't dispatch a purchase successful action at the end of it. So it can be hard to tell which thing in the dependency array actually triggered the use effect to make it run. And it's also hard to tell which things will change as it runs. Some values might just get set to the same thing they were before and not really have any effect. So how would I fix this now? Or how would I use effect better? One thing is I would prefer to use higher level abstractions most of the time. So I would try to treat use effect as a primitive. And build other things on top of it. Use effect is like assembler, and you have more powerful things you can use in your projects. So I think of things like SWR or React query to help with your input and output from external services. I think about routers, which we were using, that let you move some state into the URL. And there's also another library called React Use, which is like 100 hooks for integrating with different browser APIs and a little bit of other state management stuff. And you can bring these into your projects and just make it not your responsibility. This stuff doesn't have to end up in your code where it might start neat, but get messy over time. It's just in another package, which is open source at least. The other thing I think that would be better is to just use effect less often. So it's okay to just recalculate data at render time. It doesn't have to be cached in a set state, which is updated by an effect. And you can also move more of the logic into event handlers so that use effect is doing less of the work. Event handlers run at much more predictable times than use effects do, I find. So what is this? What is this one? Oh yeah. So another thing you can do is name them and encapsulate them. So rather than having these anonymous functions all over your code base, I take that use effect and put it inside my own hook. And my own hook has a name. So it's now clear what the purpose of this is and what business problem it solves and when might be an appropriate time to add more code into it. And that can be done either with a custom hook or the idea I showed earlier to make testing easier. You can just put a function inside of your hook, and this will show up in your stack traces. And if you run into a case where the name of a hook is turning into a ridiculously long thing, maybe that's a sign that it's time to subdivide this into many more smaller things. So notice any reoccurring themes? So I'll say again, it's like the product and team evolved, but we found React and its own documentation did not provide enough patterns, structure, or guidance to help us scale smoothly. And we didn't stop to write our own early or often enough to make up for that. And the other thing I'd add here is that something like Redux, there's other things to add here. So a lot of my suggestions are to give functions names, to divide things up into smaller pieces with distinct roles. And that's kind of what like other state management libraries would do for you, right? in the end, it's kind of like providing these guidelines is like started the groundwork of creating my own state management library. So aside from the stuff related to that project, there are other things you can do to help with state management in plain old React contexts. So Kent C. Dodds has a whole bunch of blog posts on his website related to this. These are, and I think he updates them over time, because I feel like this one's changed over the last couple of years. So these are worth checking out. There's also this tool, ReactTime. And this is kind of like the Redux dev tools, but it works at the scale of your whole application. So it's keeping track of changes to the whole React tree, and you can go back in time and see what the previous states were. I haven't used this one a ton. There were some things that turned me off from it a year or two ago, but maybe it's better now. It's worth investigating. Why did you render is another good one. This will spit out console logs about what props are changing inside of your components. And this can help you with debugging extra renders or other issues that come up. This one is clearly pointing out, some component was re-rendered because the props object itself changed, but its values are all equal. And this could have been avoided. That's really helpful. And if you want to move up a level of abstraction from React context, but not go all the way to Redux because it's overkill, there's a whole bunch of other libraries you can check out. And this list is still growing. And I get excited by the ones that work with Redux dev tools because I like those things. Yeah. So if you find yourself in a scenario where you're debating like Redux versus plain React context for your team's project, these are some of the questions I'd ask. Like, do you need a speed boost from the simplicity and flexibility that React context provides at the very start of your project? Like, are you under a huge crunch to get things running, or and show it fast? Or is the goal further down the road more important? That could play a factor. And if you do choose that initial speed boost, is it an acceptable trade-off for slowing down later and reevaluating your choices? Because chances are that's going to come up sooner with context than if you had chosen something else. Another thing to ask is, will your future team uncover strategies and structures that work well for them, and then document them for your future team to follow and fix the tech debt they've created? Because it's a bit like making your own framework or your own library. And you're going to create tech debt. You can't avoid it. And another thing to ask is, what is your team familiar with already? Maybe they're familiar with Redux, maybe they're familiar with context. Is now the right time to put something new in front of them? This is another way I like to think about it. At Rangle, we spent a lot of time arguing like Angular versus React and Redux. And I sort of see this spectrum with like Angular and Vue being like batteries included frameworks that make a lot of decisions for you. And React and Redux are kind of looser, and you get to bring your own libraries to solve the other problems. And then React and context is like a new spot further out along the spectrum, where it's more like bring your own everything, your own practices, your own guidelines for how state should be managed, as well as all the other libraries you'd need in a React and Redux project. So if I've learned things from this, I'd say Redux is definitely not dead. But I am very surprised by how far you can get with plain old context. Like this project, that was millions or billions of dollars in food sales running through something without a formal, strict state management thing. Pretty cool. If I'm going to suggest React context over an established library for a team to use, I need to be prepared to write docs and set standards for the team for how to use it so that there's some consistency and some structure to the application. I'd say that, and the reason is because the React's built-in state management doesn't really guide you as your project grows. You're going to eventually want some higher level abstractions on top of those primitives like use effect and set state and the context. But on small projects, when you're working on things on your own or with a small team, context is a great way to get started and get moving fast with minimal overhead. It does a great job of that. There was something about this bullet point. Yeah, something I occasionally find using other libraries is you're facing a problem, and then you go read the docs and you have this aha moment, and like the framework already has something built in that can help you with exactly what you're struggling with. And that doesn't happen with React context because there just isn't a whole lot to it. So you get to find those solutions on your own, or you have to invent it. And that's it. And I think I'm pretty on time, 40-ish minutes. Nice. So I think I've got 10 minutes for questions before our next speaker.
Well, yeah, you have a little more than 10 minutes. That's fantastic. I was excited. So I think we do have one question that came from the chat. That is okay. Using context, do you have a debugger tool or logger similar to the ones Redux has?
So we've got the React dev tools, and those will let you inspect individual contexts one by one to see what values are set. You can change values in them, and I think you can see what things are. Oh, hold on. I think I can use it here. So many tabs. Do I have this? So this slide deck is a React project, and I can go look at my set of components. And I suspect my slide deck has a provider somewhere. It's loading. It's not gonna work nice for a demo for me. That's too bad. So the dev tools will usually let you inspect providers and see what values they're storing. But I can't demo it right now. You can also change values. But when I compare it to the Redux dev tools, I miss the ability to see changes over time and to get a better overview. Yeah, I think to get a better overview of what all the data is, I think it's structured in a way that's easier to read. I'm kind of vague on that part, but I'm a big fan of seeing the changes in your data over time for sure, and that's missing here.
All right, so let me remind you folks, you can ask the questions directly if you find the space and don't just ask everyone at the same time. And you can also throw the question on the chat. In that case, I can read that question for you.
I have a question here. Could you give a little bit more details? Why do you think Redux is harder in the beginning than using context?
Sure. So I'm thinking back to 2018 or 2019. I'm not totally up to date on this. So there's a lot more concepts to keep track of. There's, initial Redux out of the box. You're going to have these things called actions, these things called action creators, these things that dispatch actions. You're going to have reducers, and then and selectors, and then you're going to add on top of that maybe some middleware like Redux Saga or observables. And then once you understand all this stuff and it's time to start writing code, these are probably spread out amongst a whole bunch of files. You may find that, where is I going with that one? If you're using TypeScript, you're not only going to be creating all of these objects and functions that do little things, you're also going to be setting up the types for them. So maybe that's fine, and you start and you make a few of them, and then it's time to refactor. And now you've got a lot of things to rename and move around before your application can run again. It's tough to have like an intermediate state of like, this is half refactored and I can check my work, check a running website. Test-driven development comes in pretty handy for that. The point is that you have a lot of little bits of code spread out amongst a lot of places, and mentally it can get hard to keep track of early on. Once you've been in the project for a while, it gets easier, and you build up, you establish habits and things get memorized, but it can be a slow, frustrating start to a project. And when I compare that to starting a new project with context, there's a lot less stuff to remember. And some of that is just like things like use effect and use state. You use the same things inside of your regular React components anyway. So there's a lot less new stuff to learn. You probably have code not spread out a whole bunch of files, but more in one place. And you'll probably have fewer but longer functions, which can be worse for testing, but does make it easier to like mash concepts into like a usable form early on in a project.
So just as a follow-up, in a React context version of state management, how is the state updated? Is it direct manipulation, or is it some kind of synchronous function pattern like Flux, like Redux implement?
You've got two options, and I only showed one of them here. So one of them is use state, using the use state hook. So set items would be a function that you expose to your other components to update state, and you would probably just pass it the next value that you want it to be. It could be the next object you want it to be, or the next string that you want it to be. But there isn't like an elaborate one-way data flow or any real pattern to follow. It's just a setter. You mentioned synchronous or asynchronous. One interesting thing is that set items is, in general, setters, when you use state, setters are asynchronous. So if I were to call set items, and then right after I go check on the next line, I go check what items is, it's going to be the previous value. It won't have updated yet until like the next render, I think. So it is. So I guess you'd say it is asynchronous. And in this example, it's a very simple, just like a setter. The option I didn't show is that there's also use reducer. So you can provide it's another hook, and you can provide a reducer function, kind of like Redux. And that would give you a bit more control and the ability to manipulate multiple pieces of data at once. So that one's good for, say you're making a thing that fetches information off the internet, like literally makes an AJAX request, and you want to update your data and your error state and your progress or like loading state all at the same time when the download finishes. That would be a time that you might choose use reducer over use state.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, but again, it just provides you a function which you pass down to any component or other provider to use. So it's not quite a setter, but it's still just like a very simple asynchronous thing. There's no strict data flow going on like with Redux.
Very cool. So I have a few questions more coming from the chat. One question is like, is React.js in great demand compared to data analytics and web development? Which career is the better to choose?
Go with the one you're excited about.
There you go. That's usually my answer to this type of thing. Right?
There's room for both, and I can't tell you which one. I'm not sure which one we need more of, but if you pick one you don't like, you will not have a good time. And won't continue with it.
Cool. Another question here about code reuse. So you mentioned that there's an Ionic project. Could you reuse context you set up for web on Ionic? Absolutely.
So this is like the mini version. This will work fine in Ionic. If you, just for people who aren't aware, Ionic provides you sort of helpers for loading a a React, and maybe it still supports Angular and Vue. I've lost track, but it provides some helpers for loading some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript-based web application into a native application that would get distributed in an app store. So it'll help with communication between the two. And yes, this would work inside of it. No problem there. Pretty much any React state management library would work with it. I can't think of one that would not.
Very cool. So another question I have here, I have quite a few. I have not used context because of Redux Toolkit, which greatly simplifies the interface and avoids a lot of the boilerplate scariness at the beginning. Still worth checking out context, in your opinion, or just stick with Redux Toolkit?
Good one. So I'd check out context just because it's a thing to learn and you never know when it's going to be useful. But I think if you're happy with what you have, there isn't a good reason to change. But if you're curious, go fulfill that curiosity for sure. Because I guess like I showed, if you have a large application that makes really good use of Redux, changing it to use context would be quite a bit of work and you might not see a lot of benefit. So keep going with Redux if you're happy.
Oh, Mr. Vesco.
Hello, thank you. Great chat, first of all. Really cool talk. Definitely aligned with some of the conversations I've been having at my company and sort of getting into that new React age. I was wondering, given hindsight is 2020, if you were to start this exact project again in 2022? I don't know, COVID's messed my brain up. If you started it again today, would you adopt that approach you're talking about where you kind of have almost a style guide for the way you're writing context? Would you reach for Redux right away? Would you do more of a hybrid approach? What would be like the three things you'd really focus on moving forward?
I think I'd go investigate one of these other little libraries right away. I don't know too much about them. I've done like a couple of tutorials, but I haven't tried to scale an application up. But I look at the size of these and go, like, given a similar context to like how this project was started, these could have worked out pretty well. These didn't exist when this project was started. These are the result of people learning what works and doesn't work. But I'd be very curious about these and seeing if a team full of new developers could use them well. And what would scaling it be like? I think that's where I'd start.
Yeah, cool. Because yeah, we use Recoil, Context, and React Query, which for us has been more than enough. It kind of provides all that tooling and a little bit of GraphQL-iness in there for API fetching and stuff. So cool. Thanks for that.
No problem.
Cool. Questions. I think I have another one right now. Redux uses Flux architecture, which Facebook recommended to use. What do you think about that? Don't that give an advantage over context?
Yeah, so I guess like I pointed out here earlier, I used it for many years and had a good time with it. I think there are some advantages in terms of it just being kind of predictable. Maybe it's not an issue with Flux specifically, but you grab a library like Redux and it comes with a whole bunch of structure and rules for you to follow. And when you're working on a large application with a large team, having those things is really helpful. I haven't decided if Flux on its own has advantages that still matter to me, or if I was really just into the structure that Redux provided. I guess I can't say, because I haven't tried any libraries that use Flux but are not Redux. I have a hard time. I don't have any practical experience with these as two separate contexts. So I'd say Redux, yeah, it does have advantages over context when you pair it with the right kind of project. But there are places where the simplicity that context provides Even if things are less predictable, that might be desirable in small, fast-moving projects. So there's a time and place for both. I can't recommend one over the other all the time.
Yeah, this is one of the hardest things, right? It's super hard to recommend one thing in absolute terms, because everything depends on what you're going to use it for, right? Though I'll be hard pressed to find a use for jQuery these days. Right, I have no more questions on chat. I'll give you a couple of seconds to raise your hand. If not, I'm gonna thank Adam for his amazing presentation.
Philip Davis had a good call out. Was it the set item? Set items? Yeah, I'm sure this could be more efficient. Thank you for noticing.
All right, well, Adam, this has been amazing. I really like the talk. It's not every day we can get a glimpse of what a real life use case looks like in such a deep and comprehensive way, right? And as you said in the beginning, the small context tutorials you see everywhere does no justice to the actual trade-offs of things, right? So you end up having a naive approach to it, and might end up with a lot more problems than you paid for. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, folks, for the questions and very thoughtful corrections of functions that you gave us. For you folks, if you didn't catch it on the chat, this presentation, of course, is being recorded. This meetup is being recorded, and it's going to be made available on the Rangle YouTube channel. Make sure you check that out, and use if you share it around, use the hashtag #LearnWithWrangle, so you can like spread the word around and let people know what you're learning here, and also use that on social media to let us know. And even you can even like tag at Rangle.io to let us know what type of things you want to see in this type of event. If you want to see additional types of event for other technologies, and if you're interested in certain topics, we're always eager to connect with the community and make great things happen. All right, our next speaker is Miguel Vesco. Miguel Vesco comes to us from Up&Up, and he's a software engineer there, and he has one of the best descriptions of what a person is passionate about. He's passionate about the intersection between business and technology. That's where we all live, right? Well, he has a background on mechatronics engineering. I wish he could talk a little bit about that. But the thing he's going to talk about is about CI/CD and you, right? That's a very interesting topic. And if you're ready, Miguel, we're ready for you.
Oh, ready to go. Let me just share my presentation and we'll get this kicked off. Hey, everybody, how are you doing? We can talk about mechatronics engineering. I think a lot of the time I just ended up saying I did robots when I went to school. It sounds a lot cooler than it actually is. Keynote. Sorry about that. All right, there we go. Monorepo is CI and you. Honestly, the title is it's a working title, but I think it affects everyone, especially once you actually get started with these things. Lots of exciting things to talk about in terms of monorepos. So, anyways, what is it? What's a monorepo? Well, it's not a multi-repo. Wikipedia defines a monorepo as a software development strategy where code for many projects is stored in the same repository. Oh, wow. would have never guessed. But it's honestly not just about code co-location. It's not just putting projects together, right? Everything can be in the same place, but there's a second, at least set up by Monorepo tools, a working body that's pushing this forward. It's a second definition that I think actually really gives it value. It shares dependencies. So monorepos share dependencies. These are well-defined relationships and interrelationships between all the modules and all the things that your company is building. Take, for example, application 1, application 2. We have a library that is shared amongst them. We can clearly see and define these relationships across the entire repo. What is it not? It's not a monolith. We've in the past, or things have changed over time, but we're probably used to thinking of monoliths as a single place where we put all our code and all our dependencies and everything is managed there. A monolith is just a giant app. It's non-modular. There's no tight coupling of information, right? There's no division, there's no encapsulation. For the most part, you're missing discrete pieces and components that you're using across your various projects. So not a monolith, not a multi-repo, it's a monorepo. Okay, cool. So you've talked about what a monorepo is, but the question is, why do I want a monorepo? Well, for that, I think I have to get a little bit into the history of monorepos and to provide you with a little bit more context on how we got here. I think a couple of decades ago, years 2000, we've started sharing code bases. This concept actually goes pretty far, but things arose in there that got a little bit hefty. Tooling, for the most part, was not up to par on what we could do with large extraneous code bases. We're thinking like IBM, Oracle, how they manage their dependencies, how they manage their entire code bases. It was quite problematic. This kind of like started the transition. Why did we want to transition over to these multi-repos? Mainly because of team autonomy. You had independent people that were leading the charge for their teams and groups and being able to make those decisions that would affect them. They chose their own libraries, their own tooling. They wanted to move at their own speed, at their own pace, because they figured they could run faster than everybody else. But, those things create problems. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But really, why do we want it? It's because it's hot. It's so hot right now. Monorepos are in. They're very in. Google, Stripe, Microsoft, Facebook, all the large companies have been doing this, and they've actually been doing this for quite a while. They've had quite many years to set this up, figure out how it actually works, and make it usable. But I think there's a little something else that's actually affecting this, something that not everybody, you probably feel, but you're not really talking about it. Market forces. Branding and branding in these ecosystems is pushing companies to be multi-platform. All these platforms that are coming out, you want to make sure that your company is visible through a mobile app, through a web app, through whatever marketing channel, and any other kind of like ecosystem that you can think of. Think of Uber Eats and all these other sub-platforms of platforms. You want to make sure that your brand, you're providing value to your customer across the spectrum. And what does that mean? Oh, okay, well, all of a sudden you have 10 different repos because you're building stuff for 10 different platforms, and they all share the same code. They all share the same stuff. So all of this kind of forces it together. Into this new market dynamic. I think it's one of the reasons why it's like really making a hard comeback, and it's made a hard comeback over the last, I'd say, 5 years or so. Harder than I remember it being, anyways. they say, history rhymes. Think about the times when we went from static pages to dynamic generation content to SPAs with React and Angular, and now we're moving into multiple page static dynamic content pages. We're taking a little bit of a step back just to curve that because somebody realized that static content is great, or multiple distributed content across the web with things like Next.js are also incredibly helpful. Well, so let's actually get a little bit into it. Full visibility. That's probably the number one thing that people think about when you're thinking of a monorepo, but it also comes alongside with a monolith. Remember, not a monolith. All the code is in one place. So honestly, what does this let us do? It's very easy to see changes across the organization. When somebody makes a pull request, you're going to see how that change is affecting all the various places in your org that are going to be affected by the code, that are going to have you're going to have to deploy, you're going to have to figure out how to change. It's really important, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. That's why CI is part of this topic of conversation, because it's not just about code location again. It's actually about all the pieces working together. Full visibility also encourages collaboration. Why does it encourage collaboration? Because you're going to have people from Team A looking at the stuff that people from Team B and Team C are pushing forward through, and they're going to be able to say, hey, I see that you're making those changes. It really encourages people to come in, look at those PRs, mention stuff that might be affecting how that particular team is operating or moving, and just generally make it an easier place to be able to push code and collaborate with other developers. When was the last time in a multi-repo where you were catching absolutely every PR that was going through into any kind of small project or large? You're probably focusing on the few that your team really cares about, and then you're forgetting about the rest. This kind of forces a little bit for you to gain a little bit of knowledge and understanding as you're pushing code, which means you're building intentionality into your code. It forces this collaboration, which forces discussion. This actually moves forward across the business because you set up the stage for developers to be able to talk openly about how they want to move forward with architecture. It's the small changes that impact the larger breadth of movement across the business. And this intentionality on when you choose what piece to go where really comes into view when you can see the whole board. So, simple code sharing. I've probably talked enough about this, but reduce code duplication is huge. You want to keep things dry, right? But at least in my experience, I've been to quite a few places where one of the tasks we have to develop about 5 days for some engineer or some developer to actually push code forward that has been already pushed in a different repo, basically copy pasting a lot of the stuff to be able to make it work. Why? Because that is written for Node.js in our Node.js repository, but now we want to push it in the client code because we realize the client can actually handle a lot of this load. So great, let's push it forward to the client. But now you got the same code in 2 places. And what happens when you have to actually, update that code? It creates quite a mess, which leads me to my next point, improving maintenance. So if you have a single place of shareable code across the various repos and libraries that you're going to be pushing, then that makes it pretty easy to make sure that business logic is maintained up to date and moving forward. Coordinating changes across the company, dependency management. It's huge across the repo. These changes are you're going to be able to quickly see how they affect the entire, all the various projects that you have across your repository, and be able to quickly adapt or change or overcome things. This kind of simplified dependency management kind of moves everything off to the side, where you don't have different versions of I don't know, some third-party library roaming around in the same 3 different repos where you have you're supporting React 15, you're supporting React 16, you're supporting React 17. We can probably do this with a bunch of other things, whether it's React Native, Gradle, or what have you. You'll likely run into this issue. The reason why this monorepo is so helpful is because usually when you end up making a sweeping change or an update to a library that you're supporting, you usually do it for everything. So the shared library impact is actually huge. It's huge across teams, and there is a little bit more upfront costs for it. I will talk about that in a second, but I think the benefits outweigh the negatives. And finally, vertical slices. When you're pushing code, it's not about pushing atomic singular code changes to one discrete service, but it's actually you're pushing features out that encompass the whole range. So if you're pushing out a change for the mobile app that also reflects a change on the web application, and that reflects a change on the API that you have to obviously make some data or structural changes, you're now seeing this entire piece of code come in, and you can read it from top to bottom. Vertical slicing, it's amazing because it's a one shot and it works, and everything will be correlated with each other. There's no awaiting changes unless you're dealing with migrations. Now that's a separate point, but we're not going that far onto this conversation for today. But for the most part, you're pushing code that all works together, and it's going to be pushed out. It's usually you're looking at feature changes. Consistent tooling. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about CI later, but what this really allows is for blueprints, and as a colleague of mine really likes to call this prior art. You're going to have prior art for the new developers that are joining your team. They're going to see how particular pieces are created. If you put a little bit more of effort into tooling, that code generation and everything that comes with that really quickly to spin up. It basically means you're bringing in like developer mobility. A developer that is working on a particular piece of code in one of your orgs can suddenly move to a different org and continue to bring in the same impact or ramp up really quickly, at least when it comes to developing and deploying. So faster project spin up. I think that's probably my favorite. It means it's super quick to actually get a project up and running. Oh, we have like all these other projects that all encompass some kind of web deployment or some kind of like React Native app or more. I don't know, Python pipelines. We can definitely make a few examples out of these, but they can be done in 5 minutes. You can get a project up and running in 5 minutes. Your CI, your CD is already all set up for it. They're ready to go. There's not a ton of setup when it comes to actually making new investments into greenfield. Now, obviously, this means that this doesn't take into account greenfield. So like we're talking different technologies, new aspects, maybe they're not, your ecosystem doesn't fully support them. And it's actually one of the why nots that we're gonna get to. Okay, so what's the catch, right? You've basically sung it across the mountains, said, hey, this is the best thing on the planet. Why should I not use it? And there's a few good reasons why monorepos were dropped probably like in the early 2000s when they came out, when somebody said, this is dumb. Upfront investment. Tooling. It's all about the tooling. It's about the limited pool of services that are compatible. Up until today, I'm sure I can find some example of a monorepo that does not support a build process for Fortran or something of the sort. We're talking languages, we're talking technology, we're talking services. Once you get into the monorepo, the tooling that you choose to go forward with is going to have to be able to support that, and that might actually mean that you're not on the bleeding edge a lot of the times, which is, I think, a fair trade depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. Degrading performance. This is probably one of the biggest ones why it was dropped. Suddenly having to load gigantic amounts of code into your computers was quite a big issue. there are companies that are working on this now. Git, Microsoft, quite a few things. These are called like virtual file systems. Think of it as how we do lazy loading on the front end for you front end people. What you're going to have is as you move across the repository, as you load things up, that's when it actually grabs and fetches and requests, and you're able to see that data without a big storage impact in whatever unit you're doing. The gradient performance doesn't just apply to storage, though. It actually applies to quite a few things in the ecosystem. That also includes building process. Another thing that we're going to talk about in a bit, but having a monorepo actually for deployment used to be prohibitively long. It would take like 30 minutes, hours of deployment to get an entire code base up online. Finally, access control. So you got access control. It is actually one of the probably the hardest things that people are working on right now. This actually includes open source. If your company is pretty huge in open source, there are tools out there, but it is not friendly to get open source up and running on a monorepo, because who actually controls what visibility. The whole point of this thing is that it's completely open to absolutely every developer. So if you have to manage permissions and responsibilities and let people see particular aspects or sides, now you're looking into tooling to view the tooling, and so you're putting on an abstract layer on top of that. And I don't think anyone has tackled that yet. Or sorry, there are companies working on it, but it hasn't reached the mainstream. So I would say that if that is something that you're heavily onto, that you need singular pieces that you're putting out into the world, they likely won't be part of the monorepo, but they might just be brought in as dependencies anyways. So let's talk about general tooling. So if you got a monorepo, Basil, I actually don't know how to say this. It's probably one of the most well-known across the tech world in the past decade. Google has been working on this for a pretty long time, and they have refined it. There are issues that came out of that, because once you try to actually set up this tooling and allow other people to use it, it created a problem. It wasn't built from the ground up to be shared and distributed as a system. And that's where another tool that we're going to explore today, NX, actually comes in. You got Gradle, you got NX from Narwhal, Turbo Repo from Vercel, Rush from Microsoft. I think Microsoft actually has a couple ones. But in terms of tooling, you have quite a bit of choice. There's a lot out there, and since most developers tend to zoom into an ecosystem and kind of remain in there, most companies do just because it makes sense. You'll get to, sorry about that. You'll get to make the choice. Let's move forward. Constraints. So how do I choose these tools? Like most things, it's a balance, right? You look at the pros and cons, you look at the list, you look at the list of features. What is it that all these different tools provide you with? How can I make this choice? Quick spin up projects will probably help you realize what works and what doesn't work. I have a little bit, the demo that I'm going to go through today is actually pretty tight in sense of choosing weird tools to actually make it work together. So as an aside, at the end of the day, I'm probably going to say, hey, if you're building with Next.js, just pick Vercel's Turbo Repo. It'll probably be the easiest thing. It'll make your life easier. However, I wanted to show you how you can actually make a lot of the tooling work for you, regardless of what it is that you pick. So how do we move forward with this? Strangle it. Not this kind of strangling, but if you've heard of the strangler pattern, meaning that we're actually moving a particular monolith closer towards microservices, you can actually do the same thing for your repository when you want to bring in a monorepo. I have all these services that are multi-repos all spread out across our org. How do I start? Just start. You start with one, you pick one, you set it up as the monorepo base, and you just start moving things in slowly. Eventually, you'll end up with a monorepo that you either hate or love. Probably a bit of both. So fun times. Let's actually talk about the demo. I'm going to share a different screen here. Oh, before I do that, this is a demo on getting set up with NX. And I can actually show you a little bit about the scaffolding, the 4 key commands that I'm using here. I'm going to actually skip about this slide because I'm running up on time. Usually this is a little bit of a longer talk, but I want to be conscious about everybody's time here. So these are the 4 commands that I'm going to set up so that I can actually get a React app working inside a Monorepo with NX. And what I'm going to show you now is the output of that. Now I'm going to have to share this. Cool. So hopefully you can see this. These 4 commands, if honestly run in succession, believe me, will output this folder. Now you'll see the top repo contains an apps, libs, some tools, and a bunch of the stuff that if you've done some front-end development in the last 5 years, you've probably seen, here and there. For the most part, it's all very nice and useful. You get Jest for tooling, testing for, you get Prettier to maintain linting and cohesion and consistency across your repository. You get your package JSON to show off the modules and all the dependencies that are going to happen in here. And finally, you have a few things that come from NX, and these are the NX flavored configurations, like the NX.json or the workspace.json. Workspace.json, just for the most part, mentioning what exactly is going on in this particular workspace. You'll notice here that I have two SPA configurations. One is the actual SPA, the other one's an E2E and test runner. If I go into apps, you'll see that the SPA that was generated, this is a completely brand new, out of the box. You've probably worked with scaffolding tools before, but the nice part about this is that all the tooling that is in NX is made to work with each other. So a lot of the versions that are set up, it is a bit of a problem when you try to move forward particular pieces, but out of the box, everything works. You get a source file, you get an app. For the most part, it's I think the templating is pretty good. Obviously, we can debate about folder structure all day, every day, whether you like co-located modules versus feature folders, but it's not really what I'm here to talk about. So what does this give you? If I run, if I go in here and we talk a little bit about the dependency modules, right? NX Graph is a dependency viewer that comes straight out of the box from NX. If you take a look at this, this is literally just a dependency graph. You'll see here my SPA and SPA E2E with an implicit dependency on SPA.
You're seeing your terminal.
Oh, thank you very much. Huh. Let's open up. All right, that's what happens when I don't just share my entire screen. How about that? Let's do that. Thank you. You'll see here the SPA and the SPA E2E, which is the project, which has an implicit relationship to this SPA. So how does this actually make sense? Well, if you go in to relationships. So this particular repo is the same exact repo that we generated before. The only difference is that we've actually generated a Node Express API. Again, literally just three commands. Generate Express, generate an API. The API gets generated. A proxy gets set up between your SPA app and the API. And one last thing that we created was a shared library. This shared library is actually read between both the API and the SPA. It's one of the reasons why I say it's shared code. If I actually go take a look into this, you'll see that the shared library just runs a simple function, shared, and returns shared as a string. Since this is just a demo, what I've done is I've gone into the app for the SPA. I've included here from my company shared, and I'm just displaying it as part of the main welcome screen. I've done the same exact same thing with my API. I've added it, and instead of the saying welcome to API, I'm now saying welcome to this shared library. When I run all of this, you'll see that the index graph will actually show these dependencies in relation to each other. So across the whole code, you're actually going to be able to see how your various repos interact with each other. Cool. So let me run back to my presentation. When can I get started? Literally just now, like right away. I mentioned moving into a monorepo is quite quick and efficient. It doesn't have to be an X. There's all the other tools that I mentioned, and they're pretty great at being able to work with, they're pretty extensible. So you'll be able to make them work with a few other things in your ecosystem. Talking about the ecosystem, a lot of, since this market forces are in play, Git, for example, now supports viewing all the changes from all the repos inside a commit with simplified tooling across to see what has changed in your particular large monorepo. For example, take a look at this particular change from my app and my other app. You can see what has changed across them. It's these small things that is moving the industry forward. It's GitHub is supporting this. A bunch of other tooling is coming up and setting up to support. I think Netlify has started supporting monorepos quite recently. I think a year ago, a few of their tooling has changed. So you'll actually see a lot of support coming in to be able to move quickly to a monorepo. So CI, build pipeline, the last neglected piece of this puzzle. Why is it so important to actually pick the tooling for CI? You have Circle CI, GitHub Actions, each ecosystem like a cloud build from Google or Azure pipelines will provide you with ways to build. But it is really important to actually make this work with your monorepo. The reason why is you have a bunch of projects being built at the same time. And it is key to actually make these guys work together so that you spend the minimum amount of time building them. What this means is, in the simplest of terms, is I only want to build what has changed. And so things like an X that provide you with that graph, you can quickly tell when something has changed in that graph, which dependencies have changed. And so we can actually move and look and build our CI tools to reflect how those changes are coming and only build what is necessary. I've closed off my sharing is because I'm about to share one last thing. So this is, I have a GitHub repo up and running, a monorepo sample that I can happily share the link after with, and you'll find this particular app running in there. It is incredibly similar to what I discussed here. An API, 2 apps, we're using Nest.js instead of a React SPA just to demonstrate that you can. A model that is being shared across various libs and a particular CI tooling. This CI tooling is just using GitHub Actions. At work with Up and Up, we actually use Circle CI because we find it's a little bit easier to manage conditional building based on particular things than I've found GitHub Actions. Mind you, I'm a little bit newer to GitHub Actions than I am to Circle CI. But in this particular example, I have 3 main things running. 1, a test. And to make this a little bit, to dumb this down, because honestly, it's a lot of code in here that doesn't necessarily might make sense here. But the most important key here is this guy. We're actually linting the whole workspace. We're formatting the space. We're only building and testing the affected changed applications. And why this is super important is because we don't actually want to waste precious CI time every time when we're building out these things. This is just a 3-part repo. Imagine having 50 projects. This would never get off the ground. obviously parallelization, virtualization, and everything comes into play. And that's why we prefer Circle CI, because it has gotten these things correct-ish, but it allows us to build things quickly. Now, this particular step is going to output and say, hey, I have changes for API or for Forester, one or the other. The next steps on the deployment will look and see if those changes affect them. If it does, then they build. If they don't, then they won't. So we don't actually get a deployment when we don't want to. So what's really cool about this? What's really cool about this is that if I have a repo and I have some pull requests that are being built, I have these being built on each PR as a PR preview. And you'll actually see that if, for example, two things have changed. If you go into file changes, you see two things have changed. The app has changed and the API has changed. Then I get to actually build both. Sorry about that. Checks, CI, summary. And you can see that I've deployed both previews in here. Deployed API preview, deployed Forester preview. If I, for example, go to a PR that only has a single change to the app, and I go check out the build, then you'll notice that only the app has built. And likewise for the API, you can see all the changes that apply across these are all being built real time. These are PR previews. The exact same code is now displaying the differences using each particular instance that gets built. So some of these are PRs that work together. For example, I have a PR that pushes out the new web code and a new API that work together, while I have another one, a different PR, that pushes out a new app code that talks to production API, because there was no need to build a new production API. And I have a different one that just pushes an API. So you'll find that it's really cool once you get things to actually work and run as you expect them to. And hopefully that really just leads to the Zen and the you part of my presentation. Because you will be able to live a little bit happier knowing that all the changes are consistent. You know everything that's being affected in your company's repo and org, and you can probably live a little bit less stressed knowing all the changes that are going to happen. Also, PR previews are amazing. Go with Vercel. They make that easier. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Miguel. That was very, very cool. So thank you. I'll see if I have some questions here for you folks. And I guess if you folks have some very pressing, urgent things you really want to know right now, you can just ask immediately.
Can you show once again in the code those four modules that comprise the Monorepo?
Yeah, sure. I can run through those as quickly as I can. Is there something in particular that you want me to show you, or would you prefer to just share the link to the? It's open source. You can see it.
No, I just missed that example. I just wanted to understand how does it different from monolith?
Sorry, how is it different than a monolith?
Yeah,
gotcha. The reason why it's different than a monolith, so it looks like a monolith because you're just seeing a top level repository where it looks like it's just one big app, but it's actually all the apps are inside this particular app folder. So API is an app, Fortress is an app. All of these are different apps.
If you open them, it's just the source code for them, right?
Yes, it's a source code for them.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
No problem.
So I have one question from the. Oh, go ahead. Do you have another one? Right. So I have one question from the chat. Person asking, how do you choose the right build pipeline? Circle CI versus others.
It's all in the constraints. It's how your team operates. There's a few things that come into it. Obviously, like cost and resourcing. Do you have the time to spin up your own pipeline? Do you have the resources, the technical know-how within your team to be able to bring that up to life, right? That's one thing I would consider. The second thing is obviously ecosystem constraints. So you have everything with AWS. Does it really make sense to build everything in Basil? Probably, or Basil, sorry. Probably not. There's definitely, you'll be fighting against a lot of the tooling in that decision. The other things that come into play is probably maintainability. Things like, do we have the expertise to maintain this? Is this a thing that is supported by a large and well-known company and will continue to run for the next 5 to 10 years before you throw it away in a pile of trash and hate it? Hopefully. So yeah, I'd say there's obviously, however, whatever your decision-making tree looks like, I would consider putting the weights into the appropriate places for what to choose. But I think the nice part about a lot of the tooling nowadays is that all of it is pretty extensible. As you can see, I've literally used NX with GitHub Actions, with a lot of with App Engine. None of these things are really meant to work together, but they can.
Right, I have a question about the slides for both presentations, folks. Are folks gonna make them available?
The slides?
Yep.
I can, sure.
I don't think the slides are going online, but there is a video of this being recorded. So
yeah, that's true.
I would
Right.
look.
Oh yeah, that's true. The video is gonna be posted on the Rangle YouTube channel, so keep an eye on there, and you're probably gonna find a better version of the slides with the narrative. I have one question myself. You even if you have like very smart tooling in place to make sure you only build on your CI/CD the parts that are changed, even then you can actually have touched, if you go vertical slice, right? You can touch several different things across this. So it can be a pretty substantial build. Are there tooling to make this build faster, or even to try and make these things more manageable?
Yes, there are some, but from what I've seen, a lot of the homegrown monorepos I found that have worked around certain problems like these. For example, using virtualization to pump out multiple different apps at the same time across various, like the scalability of the pipeline itself is important. When you look at various changes across the repo, you need to be able to make those dependency matches, because if something, for example, isn't necessarily dependent on other things, but has changed, then that means that can build by itself alone. So there's some optimizations. And if it can build alone, that means you can just dump it into its own process and let it build. It's the only problem that I've seen, and where it gets a little bit tedious, is when things depend a lot on each other. For example, the PR previews that I made, and I specifically made this contrived example to be a little slow, is because I want to be able to build my my application on top of a PR preview that is released by App Engine. So App Engine needs to first build the API. There's no way around this. Then I need to be able to get the output of that and be able to use that output for building my actual app, so that it's actually sharing the URL. It's talking to the right spin up, right? There are some ways to go around that. If, for example, I was able to know what the if I was able to know the code or the URL that is going to spin up for that particular server in advance, then I would be able to make that choice. However, App Engine does not allow you to do that. We could homegrown our own setup for telling App Engine which particular ID to use when it spins up PR. And then I can now spin both of them separately, because they're both being targeted to the same thing. But until that happens, which I was not able to do within the given amount of time, you tips and tricks. If you can know some things ahead of time, great. But you're right, though. If something requires a hard dependency, there's not much there's no way really around it.
Miguel, would you recommend breaking up that last PR into 2 smaller ones so that the builds are easier?
Depending on the, not really, actually, depending on what it is that is needed. So you could break it up into an API and a front-end code just for being able to review the pieces independently. So getting one out and then figuring out what the other one is. But if the changes require you to be able to, if the changes that you're making on the front end require the changes on the back end, it's pretty difficult to actually separate those two. Hopefully that kind of answers that.
Cool. So folks, more questions for Miguel. Couldn't you do backend first, then front end after?
In terms of the release cycle, that's actually the dependency. So if front end, if you're pushing out a front end that requires the back end, then the back end will be built first.
No, I think the person means make a PR for the backend first, then make a PR for the front end.
Yeah, you could do that. But now what that entails is not simultaneous release, but you're now releasing one before the other. For sure you could. I'm not saying you couldn't. I think most of the time we run through that anyways. Like nowadays when you're doing a backend migration, usually you're targeting those changes first. And this actually creates problems because sometimes when you have to migrate things, you need to migrate changes, then you make the changes on the front end, then you deprecate changes on the back end when you have to do a 2-step migration. And honestly, I don't know anybody that likes doing 2-step migration. So the more we could avoid that, the better.
Exciting stuff. Questions, folks? Well, I think we're good for today then. So thank you very much, Miguel. This has been an amazing event with lots of interesting things to learn. And as always, if you folks want to learn about different things, if you want different presentations about things, we're always with our ears open here at Rangle. We really love sharing knowledge with the community, having great discussions about the present, the past, and the future of technology and business, right? And if you folks haven't already, check out our blog. There's a lot of content there of several different venues, like from how to assemble amazing teams all the way to how to build applications with Remix. Right. With that, I thank you, our fantastic speakers of tonight, and all of you who were here giving your presence to this fantastic event. I've been Jason Santos, and this has been Toronto React Meetup. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Nice work, Miguel.